There's a sing-song school phrase likely ingrained in your memory, a core memory. It goes a little something like this. In 1492, Columbus sailed the ocean blue. Yeah, it's time. This man has been mentioned in too many History Fix episodes to count. Mentioned more than any other single historical figure. From Vikings to rum to cannibalism, he's all over History Fix. This man sent out more shockwaves than possibly anyone, changed our whole existence culturally, spiritually, ethnically, economically, politically, geographically, morally, possibly more than any single person ever has. But despite being one of the most familiar historical figures in Western culture, few people know the first thing about Christopher Columbus. Let's fix that. Hello, I'm LaFountaine, and you're listening to History Fix, where I discuss lesser-known true stories from history you won't be able to stop thinking about. After getting lost in the world of the House of Borgia last week, I figured we'd just sort of stay there for another week. Actually, another 2 weeks, because this is going to be a two-parter. I've been wanting to really delve into Christopher Columbus for a long time because his name comes up so much in my research, more than you'd ever expect, more than I've even included in these last 79 episodes. And yet still, I've said his name a lot. A lot. October 14th is Christopher Columbus Day in the United States. Yes, Christopher Columbus still has a day, so just let that sink in as you listen to this story. Maybe by the end you'll be able to form a solid opinion. Do you think we should be honoring Columbus with his very own holiday? I didn't even want to reserve a Sunday in October for this episode. October is for Spooktober, not this jerk. Yes, friends, Spooktober is coming back, and I'm so excited. I have some really fun, spooky topics picked out, and so that's why I'm doing Columbus a month early. He doesn't deserve that time slot. That's valuable real estate, and this guy really, really, really sucked. But while Columbus is an extremely well-known historical figure, it's actually kind of weird how much we don't know about him, and how much misinformation we do know about him. I had no idea that he personally introduced sugar to the Americas, not until I interviewed my friends Matt and Scott for the rum episode. I had no idea he misrepresented the indigenous people of the Caribbean to the Spanish monarchs as bloodthirsty cannibals in order to justify enslaving them until I researched the cannibalism episode. I had a little bit of an idea that he may not have been the first to, quote, discover the Americas, but I had no idea how solid the evidence against it was until I studied Vikings and Polynesian wayfinders. And I had no idea what a truly sadistic psycho freak he was until right now. But even simple things. I don't think many people even know that Christopher Columbus was Italian. He sailed for Spain, and we're determined to call him by an anglicized name. I honestly think most people think he was Spanish or even English. I doubt many people know anything about his early life, his family, where he came from, when he was born, and I don't think many people know his fate, how he died, when he died, where he died. So let's get into it, shall we? Starting with the man's real name, Cristoforo Colombo. I don't think many people know that name. We anglicized it in America because we made him our hero, hence Columbus Day, hence the capital of our nation, Washington, D.C., which stands for District of Columbia. The irony of that being that he sailed for our forebears' mortal enemies at the time. But anyway, I'm going to keep calling him Columbus in this episode for the sake of sparing you unnecessary confusion. But Cristoforo Colombo was the man's actual name. Before Columbus was even born, Europe had started to get antsy. They had done all the things on their continent. They were getting bored. They were ready to get out, stretch their legs, see what else there was to see on this planet, and really, if we're being honest, see what else there was to gain. This started with the Portuguese in the 1420s. Small Portuguese ships called caravels, not to be confused with the popular ice cream cake brand Carvel, zipped on down the coast of Africa. They came back with valuable goods like spices, gold, and even human beings. That's right, the Portuguese were the first to transport enslaved Africans to Europe. They started that leg of the slave trade. Now it's like, Porta who? Isn't it weird how these world powers just sort of come and go? Or maybe it's scary how these world powers come and go. Maybe weird was the wrong word there. But anyway, the Age of Discovery, or the Age of Exploration, as it was called, started with the Portuguese in the early to mid 1400s. Now, Portugal's neighbor, Spain, they see these ships coming back from Africa laden with spoils and riches, and they want in. But they're a bit busy at the moment. They are elbows deep in the Reconquista, which was, to put it simply, kicking all of the Jewish and Muslim people out of their country. By the end of the century, they've pretty well finished that job. They dust off their hands, and they're like, cool, get us in on this conquering other lands thing now, which is just so dang hypocritical. I mean, think about it. They just spent centuries trying to expel these people they viewed as invaders, Jewish people and Muslims. They just spent centuries trying to get them out of Spain. Now what are they going to do? They're going to go invade some other country. They're going to become the invaders? I don't get it. But there's gold somewhere, and that's motivation enough. All right, press pause on Spain. Let's go to Italy. Genoa, Italy, 1451. Christopher Columbus is born. His father was believed to have been a weaver and a wool merchant, so the family would have been fairly middle class. They weren't like nobility or anything like that. When he was a teenager, Columbus got a job working on a merchant ship sailing all over. Some sources say that his ship was attacked by pirates as it sailed by Portugal. The ship sank, but Columbus survived, floating to shore on a piece of debris, and was like, cool, I'll just chill here in Portugal, I guess. That, I don't know, that seems a bit embellishy, and a lot of sources don't mention it, so grain of salt. But whatever happened, he did settle down in Portugal by about 1476. And he began to study math, astronomy, cartography, and navigation. So as he's learning about exploration, that's essentially what those 4 subjects add up to, he starts to hatch this master plan. Because he knows Europe is starting to itch for goods from far-off lands, Africa, but especially Asia. Because there's good stuff in Asia, but it's really hard and dangerous to get to. You have to travel over land, the Silk Road, that is mostly controlled by the Ottomans, who aren't very nice. There's a lot of political instability in the area. It's rough terrain. It's enemy territory. It's just a borderline impossible trade route, making goods like silk and spices from Asia very hard to get and therefore very expensive. But Columbus believes that he can find an alternate sea route to Asia. He believes that if he just sails west, he will be able to sail all the way around the earth and he will end up back in Asia. And he incorrectly believes that this route will be easier than sailing around the southern tip of Africa. He thinks he's a genius. He goes to the leaders of Portugal, and he's like, let me do this. Send me, fund me, sponsor me, let me find this westward route to Asia in the name of Portugal. And they're like, no way. He goes to France. He goes to England. They all shut him down. They're like, no, that's a terrible idea. Get out of here. Now, there's a lot of misconceptions about this part of the story. In the past, at least, we were led to believe that people thought the earth was flat at this point, and that's why Portugal, France, England, that's why they weren't buying into Columbus' plan. They thought that he was wrong to believe that he could sail around the world to get to Asia, that Columbus was some sort of revolutionary new thinker who figured out that the earth wasn't flat. No, it was common knowledge at this point that the earth was not flat. Over 500 years ago. Some modern humans have some catching up to do, don't they? I'm not going to go there. Anyway, Columbus didn't come up with this idea. It was common knowledge, and it's not the reason he kept getting denied. The reason he kept getting denied is because his calculations were fundamentally flawed. He thought he'd only have to sail around 2,400 miles west to reach Asia, which is a vast, vast underestimation. In fact, it's more like 11,000 miles, and you're going to hit 2 continents and a whole nother ocean, the largest ocean by far, before you get there. So he wasn't getting turned down by these countries because he was like a visionary, ahead of his time thinker. He was getting turned down because he was straight up wrong, and they knew it. But that got a bit twisted at some point to help glorify Columbus. Eventually, he does find a sponsor, Ferdinand and Isabella of Spain, Los Reyes Católicos, the Catholic monarchs. Remember, their marriage had been approved by Rodrigo Borgia, who would soon become Pope Alexander VI, the chestnut orgy guy from last week. He approved their marriage, gave them permission to unite the kingdoms of Spain, and named them the official Catholic monarchs of Europe. Borgia basically made them. And they're into the idea. They're not really worried about mileage miscalculations. They're like, hey, there's something that way. We don't even know what it is. Let's go find out. Which, how crazy is that, y'all? What if there was some direction you could go on Earth today where you just had no idea what you might find? Isn't that wild? So they want him to go find riches and whatnot, gold, untapped resources, but they're also interested in spreading Christianity to the rest of the world. So they like the idea of finding people that can be converted. Columbus has the same goals in mind. He's also after riches, and he's a devout Catholic himself, at least on paper. So he's down with the whole evangelization plan. He also wants fame. He wants to go down in history as the first guy who did this sail around the world thing. His agreement with Ferdinand and Isabella stated that he could keep 10% of whatever riches he found, plus a noble title of Admiral of the Ocean Sea, and he would also be governor of whatever lands he encountered. Just automatically be governor, which is such a stupid promise. Sure, you can go ahead and just control whatever land you find, regardless of who's already in charge there. It's just the most pompous, egotistical plan. And these are overly generous terms, but as Columbus' son would later write, Ferdinand and Isabella were not confident at all that Columbus would return from this voyage. So they may have made some promises they didn't think they'd actually have to keep. Sure, yeah, you can go ahead and rule over whatever and find and take some of the gold, and we'll call you Admiral of the Ocean Sea. That has a nice ring to it. Sure, sounds good, whatever. Good luck, dude. On August 3rd, 1492, Columbus and his crew left Spain in 3 ships. You know them as the Niña, the Pinta, and the Santa Maria, but only one of the 3 names is technically correct. Back then, it was common for ships to have official names and also nicknames. The Santa Maria was the actual name of that ship, but that isn't what people called it. They called it by its nickname, La Gallega. The other 2, the Niña and the Pinta, those were just their nicknames. The Niña was actually called the Santa Clara, and we don't actually know the real name of the ship nicknamed the Pinta. So they set sail on these 3 ships. The Santa Maria was a regular-sized ship. The Niña and the Pinta were those smaller caravel ships. 10 weeks later, on October 12th, they make landfall somewhere in the Bahamas, most likely Watlings Island or San Salvador. Now, just think about this timing for a second. They sailed from early August to mid-October, straight up hurricane season. And they got very, very lucky that they didn't encounter a hurricane, which would have ended the whole thing right then and there. Just imagine how much one well-placed storm could have completely altered history. But it's smooth sailing, and they make it to the Bahamas after 2 months at sea. A sailor aboard the Pinta named Rodrigo de Triana actually spotted land first. But Columbus would later claim that he himself had made the first sighting in order to claim a promised reward of 10,000 maravedis, which was what Spanish money was called then. So already from the very beginning, we see a tendency toward greed. You think 10% of all the riches discovered and the right to govern all lands would be enough. But no, he's also got to steal this meager reward from this lowly sailor guy. Now, Columbus has sailed already way farther than he thought he would have to, over 4,000 miles. And he's finally hit land. He assumes, incorrectly, that he has reached Asia, the East Indies. And so he calls the people he encounters there, members of the Lucayan, Taino, and Arawak tribes, he calls them Indians. And you guys, we still freaking call them Indians. And that is mind-blowing. The area where he first made landfall is still called the West Indies, based on a major, major mistake. He literally could not have been farther from the actual Indies, and yet these names somehow stuck for 500 years, and that says a lot. So he reaches the Bahamas, and he encounters native people who are already living there. He's keeping a detailed journal during all of this, but I want you to remember that while we have Columbus' firsthand account, we do not have that for the indigenous people. And we know these sorts of documents, these accounts, journals written by explorers were typically quite biased in their reporting. They had motives. They were trying to accomplish things, and they needed to portray the experience a certain way to their benefactors, in this case, Ferdinand and Isabella. Columbus writes about all sorts of things: the wildlife he saw, the weather, the moods of the crew, and his impression of the indigenous people, or the impression he wanted to convey to Isabella, at least, because this journal would be handed over directly to her upon his return to Spain. He writes, quote, "Many of the men I have seen have scars on their bodies, and when I made signs to them to find out how this happened, they indicated that people from other nearby islands come to San Salvador to capture them. They defend themselves the best they can. I believe that people from the mainland come here to take them as slaves. They ought to make good and skilled servants, for they repeat very quickly whatever we say to them. I think they can very easily be made Christians, for they seem to have no religion. If it pleases our Lord, I will take 6 of them to your highness when I depart, in order that they may learn our language." End quote. He also writes, quote, "They brought us parrots and balls of cotton and spears and many other things, which they exchanged for the glass beads and hawk's bells," he wrote. They willingly traded everything they owned. They were well built, with good bodies and handsome features. They do not bear arms and do not know them, for I showed them a sword. They took it by the edge and cut themselves out of ignorance. They have no iron. They would make fine servants. With 50 men, we could subjugate them all and make them do whatever we want." End quote. Columbus and his men spent the next several months sailing around to different islands in the Caribbean, looking for, quote, "pearls, precious stones, gold, silver, spices, and other objects and merchandise whatsoever," end quote. But he didn't find much. He explored Cuba and Hispaniola, which is present-day Haiti and Dominican Republic. On Christmas Day, 1492, the Santa Maria, which was the ship Columbus himself was on, ran aground near present-day Haiti and had to be abandoned. The native cacique, or chieftain there, Guacanagari, gave him permission to leave some of his men behind. So 39 men stayed behind in a makeshift settlement they called La Navidad, Christmas, because the ship ran aground on Christmas. Columbus hops on the Niña and, together with the Pinta, continues exploring. On the northeast part of Hispaniola, modern-day Dominican Republic, he encounters the Saguayo people. And this is the first group that pushes back at all. According to Columbus' account, they refused to trade the number of bows and arrows that Columbus had asked for, which seems like a minor thing and not worth breaking the peace over at all, but a skirmish ensues and a couple of Saguayo guys are injured. It's here, from the native people, that Columbus learns about an island supposedly occupied by a group of cannibals called the Caribe, as well as another island called Matinino that was only occupied by women. Matinino meant island of women. This is the present-day island of Martinique. But I don't know if something got lost in translation or what. The island was not just occupied by women. The real story is that the Caribe conquered this island, killed all the men, and assimilated with the women and children that they let live. But anyway, it piques Columbus' interest, and he files it away for later because Marco Polo had written about an island in the Indian Ocean that was supposedly only inhabited by women. So this is probably more proof to Columbus that he was where he thought he was, in Asia. Mid-January 1493, the crew heads back to Spain on the Niña and the Pinta, minus those 39 men that stayed behind at La Navidad in Hispaniola. They hit terrible storms as they neared Europe and were held up in Portugal for a minute before making their way back to Spain. Half of the crew was actually arrested on the Azores Islands when they were mistakenly identified as pirates. But they get back to Spain, and Columbus presents his findings to Ferdinand and Isabella, a few small bits of gold, some pearls, gold jewelry he took from the indigenous people, a few Taino people he had kidnapped, flowers, a hammock, tobacco, which was unheard of in Europe at the time, and some pineapples. It should be noted, he did not bring back any of the trade goods they were used to getting from the actual East Indies, mostly spices like black pepper, ginger, and cloves. Yet he still insisted that he had reached Asia. Columbus believed the island of Hispaniola was just off the coast of China. He wrote of it, quote, "Hispaniola is a miracle. Mountains and hills, plains and pastures are both fertile and beautiful. The harbors are unbelievably good, and there are many wide rivers, of which the majority contain gold. There are many spices, and a great mine of gold and other metal," end quote. And this was translated into many languages and dispersed throughout Europe, causing a sensation. But it was mostly untrue. As we know, he did not actually find very much gold at all, outside of some bits and pieces that the native people had crafted into jewelry. He didn't bring back much gold, and he didn't bring back any spices. But by claiming that there were, quote, great mines of gold, he is able to maintain support of the monarchs for future voyages. At this time, Pope Alexander VI, Rodrigo Borgia, grants Spain and Portugal exclusive rights to claim this land, drawing a vertical dividing line. Columbus prepares for a second voyage. Now, the purpose of the first voyage was just to see what's out there. The purpose of the second voyage was actually to start converting the indigenous people to Christianity. That was the official stated purpose. Of course, they were still looking for gold and riches too, though. But because of the Christianity mission work he was supposed to be doing, baptizing the natives, Columbus was commanded by Ferdinand and Isabella to treat the indigenous people lovingly and to maintain peaceful relations. Okay? Bear that in mind. He set sail in September of 1493, once again during hurricane season, this time with a much larger crew and 17 ships, which included 2 larger ships and 15 of those smaller caravels, one of them the Niña once again. This time he explored a bunch of islands: Antigua, St. Martin, St. Croix, the Virgin Islands, and on the one he called Santa Cruz, which is now called St. Croix, they spotted a canoe with a few Carib men and 2 women in it. Now remember, Columbus had heard about the Carib people from other indigenous groups. These were the supposed cannibals. But he had not actually encountered them on his first voyage. Now, here they were in a canoe, and the Europeans were intrigued. So they followed the canoe, which the Caribs weren't cool with. They fired arrows at Columbus and his men, killing a guy. And so Columbus and his men then killed or captured everyone in the canoe and beheaded them. I like how Isabella was like, just be nice. We want them to like us. And Columbus somehow immediately twisted that into kill them all. Apparently, one of the crew, Michel de Cuneo, who was actually one of Columbus' childhood friends, took one of the indigenous women during the skirmish, and Columbus gave him permission to enslave her. According to Cuneo's own account, he regularly physically and sexually assaulted this woman. After that, they headed towards Puerto Rico, which was called Boriken by the native Taino people. They had quite a few indigenous people sailing with them at this point, including at least 20 Taino women and some children that had been rescued from the Carib captors who had apparently been keeping them as like sex slaves. The women explained that when they had been captured by the Carib, the men had been eaten and the boys had been castrated but allowed to live until they were big enough to eat. Now, this is coming, remember, from European reports, from guys who barely understood the language that these women were speaking. That's what they thought they heard anyway. As they sailed near Puerto Rico, these women recognized it as their homeland and actually swam to shore. And I'm sure the crew saw themselves as these great superheroes who had saved these women and children from the evil Carib and delivered them home. But I find it so ironic that the Europeans can judge the Carib for enslaving these women, taking them as sex slaves, and yet it's fine when they do it themselves. Cuneo's like, yeah, we're so righteous. Look at us doing good out here. And he's like shuffling his own sex slave back into the ship's hold. So then they go back to Hispaniola, because remember, they left 39 men behind in that settlement, La Navidad, after the Santa Maria ran aground. And the first thing they find when they get close is the decomposing bodies of 4 men, and one of them clearly has a beard, implying that he was a Spaniard, because the indigenous people did not have beards. They shoot off some cannons and light some flares to signal to the men at La Navidad, but they don't get a response back. The next day, they discover the burnt remains of La Navidad and learn from a cousin of the cacique or chieftain, Guacanagari, who was the guy who gave them permission to leave men behind there. They learn from his cousin that Guacanagari had been injured by another chief named Keonabo, and that Keonabo had killed the colonists that he had left behind. But it wasn't like a random massacre. Apparently, the Spanish dudes were kind of asking for it. Apparently, some of the men had formed a murderous gang and were causing ruckus in search of gold and women, and they had actually captured and enslaved 3 or 4 women apiece. So Keonabo was like, nope, ain't having it, not here. And he went in and killed them all. And guys, I don't feel sorry for them at all. I'm Team Keonabo on this one. So Columbus is like, well, that sucks. He leaves the ruins of La Navidad behind and establishes another settlement called La Isabela on the north coast of Hispaniola. So this is like today would be the Dominican Republic. He keeps exploring, though. He goes to Jamaica and back to Cuba, which he thinks is a peninsula of China. He doesn't even realize that it's an island. He thinks it like comes off of the mainland, which he believes to be China and not North America. They're finding little insignificant bits of gold here and there, some dust, but it's nothing at all close to what they already claimed to have found. They have to be sweating at this point. Like, all right, we can't come back empty-handed. The native people aren't showering us with all their gold like we expected. Plus, we told them there were gold mines here. I guess we gotta set up some gold mines and hope for the best. And so that's what they do. They start trying to mine for gold. But of course, these gentlemen, they're not rolling up their sleeves and digging themselves. They're forcing the indigenous people to do the work. And this is where the whole thing takes a really nasty turn. Let me remind you real quick before we keep going, though, that the goal of this second voyage, according to Isabella, Queen of Spain, was to convert the indigenous people to Christianity, to spread the good word. And she gave Columbus explicit directions to treat them with kindness and love and to focus on building positive relationships, building trust with these people. This is what he does instead. He begins subjugating the native people immediately, torturing them to learn where supposed gold was hidden, and setting up a tribute system. According to the writings of Columbus' son, Ferdinand, quote, in the Cibao, where the gold mines were, every person of 14 years of age or upward was to pay a large hawk's bell of gold dust. All others were each to pay 25 pounds of cotton. Whenever an Indian delivered his tribute, he was to receive a brass or copper token, which he must wear about his neck as proof that he had made his payment. Any Indian found without such a token was to be punished. End quote. Now, this punishment, this wasn't just like a slap on the wrist. Any native person found without one of these tokens had their hands cut off, which was basically a death sentence due to infection. On top of that, there was very little gold on the island, so it was pretty much impossible to meet this quota, to pay this tribute. According to reports, thousands of indigenous people committed suicide, chose to end their own lives rather than have their hands cut off and die a slow and painful death from infection. Now that he had them completely under his control, Columbus also began enslaving the indigenous people. In February of 1495 alone, he enslaved over 1,500 Arawak people. They were forced to work and subjected to harsh punishments, including dismemberment, cutting off ears, noses, and hands, as well as all-out decapitation. He gifted the women to Spanish colonists who regularly beat and sexually abused them. According to reporter Ara Bogado in an article for Grist, quote, pregnant Taino women who were taken captive gave birth to babies who were sometimes thrown to hungry dogs. Columbus established a business in the sale of 9- and 10-year-old Taino girls for sexual slavery. He also kidnapped and enslaved Tainos themselves, personally initiating the transatlantic slave trade in his voyage back to Europe. End quote. Yes. Let's jump to that part, the personally initiating the transatlantic slave trade part. In 1495, in lieu of the promised gold, Columbus shipped around 500 enslaved indigenous people back to Spain. About 40% of them died en route, and the rest were in very bad shape when they arrived. I don't know what he was expecting, but Queen Isabella was not pleased. In fact, she was horrified. She had given him explicit instructions to show kindness and love. In her mind, these people were Spanish now. They were Spanish subjects, and Spanish subjects could not be enslaved. She sent them straight back, and I'm sure she's really questioning putting Columbus in charge at this point. This guy is blowing it. In March of 1496, so 2.5 years after leaving Spain for this second voyage, Columbus heads back. But the ships are battered by strong winds immediately, delaying them, and they end up making landfall on the island of Guadalupe when their supplies run low. There, they request that the native people give them food for this voyage. Instead, they were ambushed by arrows. In response, they destroyed some huts and held a group of 13 women and children hostage to force the sale of food. And then they hopped back on their ships and sailed to Spain. So, things have certainly devolved between the first voyage and the second. Not only is there very little of the gold they promised, they're doing hardly anything at all to convert the indigenous people to Christianity. None of them were even baptized for 2 years after Columbus arrived for this second voyage. And then the baptizer guy got mad at Columbus and actually sailed back to Spain. And on top of that, they are horribly abusing the native people. Bogado says, quote, in short, Columbus was a murderous, enslaving, sexual abusing, treacherous colonizer to the peoples he encountered in the Caribbean. Only 2/3 of the Taínos survived just 4 years after Columbus' arrival. Some were killed, others succumbed to diseases, and fully half of the dead killed themselves rather than live with his tyranny, end quote. But you guys, this story is far from over. What I've told you so far is just the drop. It's the drop hitting the surface of the water. What happens next is the ripple. Waves of energy moving outward from the epicenter, growing larger and larger, moving ever farther away, reaching forward in all directions. Join me next week for the ripple. Thank you all so very much for listening to History Fix. I hope you found this story interesting and maybe you even learned something new. Remember to tune back in next Sunday for the rest of the story in part 2. In the meantime, be sure to follow my Instagram at HistoryFixPodcast to see some images that go along with this episode and to stay on top of new episodes as they drop. I'd also really appreciate it if you would rate and follow History Fix on whatever app you're using to listen, if you haven't done that yet. And please help me spread the word by telling a few friends about it. That'll make it much easier to get your next fix. Information used in this episode was sourced from NPR, Grist, History.com, BBC, and Wikipedia. As always, links to these sources can be found in the show notes.